We will finish off this lecture with a pro-innovation bias. And this bias you can find in academic literature, you find it in policy, in what politicians talk about, in normal articles and newspapers, in the way people talk about innovation at firms, so on. Pro-innovation bias means that we believe that innovation is something that we should always have innovation. It's always good to have lots of innovation. And we try to measure how many innovations do we have this year in this country. And if we have a lot of them, then we think that's good. But there's nothing in the definition of innovation that says that this is something that is good, whatever good is, that it benefits society or anything like that. But we tend to believe that that is the case. And part of that can be that actually the theory of diffusion of innovation, that was born from the research on hybrid corn. And that was a method that was highly effective in generating more food, and that methodology was spread in this bell curve that we have talked about. But then years later it was kind of apparent that this hybrid corn and this way of farming was not very good for the environment. So Rogers, the guy who wrote the seminal work of diffusion of innovation, he studied hybrid corn. He later returned to his work and reflected on it, and he realized that the people that he had talked to when he was doing this research, well, one of them was that he had categorized as a laggard, did not want to adopt this hybrid corn. He didn't want to start that kind of farming. And now when Rogers looked about that years later, he realized that that person that I categorized as a laggard, he was actually in the forefront when it comes to ecological farming. He thought about the environment, and that was kind of his rationale for not adopting the hybrid corn. So it's kind of hard to determine, is it good or bad, and this is what can predominantly be done in hindsight. And the reason why we have this pro-innovation bias, well, there are numerous reasons. It's, for instance, easier to attract funding for research if you have this pro-innovation bias with you, because firms and agencies, they rather support research that talk about how can we spread the new, how can we do this and ultimately gain more money. They're more interested in that than perhaps a better society. You could argue that the governmental agencies should be concerned with a better society, but they tend to believe that if we get lots of innovation, that would lead to a better society, because they have this in the back of their head that lots of innovation is good all the time, regardless of what kind of innovation it is. And you don't need a big laps of thought to realize that all innovation cannot be good. We could have an innovation that is a more effective landmine that kills children more effectively, civilians more effectively. That would be an innovation, but few of us would say that it would be a good innovation. And it is also very hard to determine the consequences of the innovation. And one example that Rogers takes up is the snowmobile that was introduced in the Sami culture, and that basically replaced their way of herding the reindeers. They were previously using a sledge and a reindeer to herd the reindeers, but then they had this culture where they could live off the reindeers to a large extent, and they had like 40-50 reindeers in each family, and they made clothes from the skin, and they ate the meat, and they could trade the meat for sugar and spices and things that they needed, so they could be kind of self-sufficient in that way. But when the snowmobile was introduced, that was a very expensive thing that quite soon it was believed that this was the way you should herd the reindeer. So they had to slaughter more reindeers in order to be able to afford a snowmobile. And the reindeers got stressed out by being herded by the snowmobile rather than the reindeer with a sledge. This led to the reindeers having less kids. So the herds grew smaller and smaller, and basically the Sami people grew more poor due to this. Less reindeers, and due to them not giving birth so as frequently as before, since they were stressed out from the snowmobile, and they're slaughtering their reindeers to a larger extent in order to afford the snowmobile. So a lot of these Sami people were driven away from their way of living, herding reindeers. And most of these families today are unemployed and dependent on the Finnish government for subsistence payment. So that's one example of an invasion that was not good for some people, at least. It was probably very good for the people who owned the snowmobile companies, because they made money. If you're interested to learn more, here are some further reading that you can look into. And this is the end of the lecture.